I want to start by reminding people what actually happened here, that in order to bail out banks and developers, the state initiated a wave of cuts to public services and waged an unremitting war on public sector workers. Overnight from the bank bailout, in advent of the Troika, the narrative became that the enemy is the teacher, the nurse, the firefighter, the workers in this House, and that their wages and conditions and their pension entitlements were the obsession of economists and commentators. They'd forgotten how the crisis erupted. All eyes were on reducing wages and pensions of public servants, and the state did just that. The state savaged the earnings and the pensions of workers and those that were retired, and slashed the pay and the pensions of new recruits. The figures vary, but one figure says that every year the state took £1.4 billion from public servants. There were 4 waves of austerity measures: a pay freeze in September 2009, the FEMPI legislation imposed an 11-month pay freeze, previous national agreements pay increases due in September of 3.5% in 2009, and in 2010 2.5% were abandoned. The pension levy was introduced in March 2009, and under FEMPI this levy is deducted at source and returned to the Exchequer, and therefore it is a reduction in gross pay. Higher rates were applied to the higher paid, but the average deduction was 7% of total salary. To give some idea of the scale, the PRD has yielded savings of about 900 million, almost £1 billion, to the Exchequer in each full year since it was introduced. A second FEMPI Pay Act was enacted in December 2009 that introduced a comprehensive pay cut from January 2010. A clerical officer on average lost €1,500 per annum in this pay cut. In 2013, the Haddington Road Agreement brought further cuts in public sector pay and pensions and a raft of productivity measures, including additional hours valued at 6% in pay terms. This agreement introduced increment deferrals, overtime rate changes and changes in flexible work practices. The USC, or the Universal Social Charge, as well as the 4 waves of cuts, the government restructured 2 levies, the income levy and the health levy, into one universal social charge. A worker on £37,000 a year, the max that a clerical officer can earn, pays almost £1,400 a year in USC. The lower paid took a huge hit, and the breakdown in these are very easy to see. During austerity years, successive government cut public sector employment across the board. Numbers fell from 320,000 to less than 290,000 in 2015. This was a job cut imposed by a blunt instrument of a moratorium, incentivised retirement and voluntary departures. Overall, there has been a 10% reduction in jobs across all of the public sector. And these cuts have resulted in huge income losses for all public and civil servants, particularly those on lower incomes between £20,000 and £37,000 a year, as well as having to work longer hours with less flexibility, more work and less supports. So the public pay bill as a result of these cuts has fallen dramatically from over £17 billion before the recession to £14 billion net in 2014. As well as taking this from workers, the money has also disappeared, I would argue, from the economy because of the loss of the discretionary income and the savings. And despite propaganda to the contrary in this country, the pay levels of the lower paid civil servants are in line with or below the OECD average, and that is according to the OECD themselves. They published statistics in December 2014 which show that the size of the Irish public sector at 18.5% is not far from the average across the OECD countries, and that their pay is in line. Official figures show that 45% of all public servants earn less than €45,000 a year, and 68% earn less than €50,000 a year. That is contrary to the impression given that the majority of public servants are Lán Abhaile and highly paid. Other emergency measures continuing to be of concern to public sectors during the same period are the starting pay for new entrants, and the then Minister of Finance determined in 2010 unilaterally and without the necessity of more legislation to reduce the pay scales for all new entrants by 10%. From 2011 onwards, they enter their pay scales at least 2 points below those that applied to their colleagues before that date. The workers concerned are therefore behind and would otherwise have been on different scales while progressing through their increments. The effect of this was compounded in 2012 by the unilateral abolition of universal allowances for new entrants. Because these allowances applied to all members of the relevant grade or category, they were in effect part of their basic pay. For example, a prison officer or a firefighter recruited from 2011 would not only have been placed on a scale that was longer than that of their colleagues, but would also have lost a significant universal allowance than their colleague retained. This issue has been addressed to a large extent and resolved in negotiations under the auspices of the Lansdowne Road Agreement, but the post-23 solution to the 2010 alteration for new post-2011 entrants means that they remain on scale points behind those that previously applied. Working hours in 2013, the Haddington Road Agreement cut the pay of public sector earnings above $65,000 a year. It provided an additional unremunerated working hours. On average, an additional 2.5 working hours were added to the working week of all public sector workers. Unremunerated working remains unresolved, while the effect of this depends on the pre-existing working hours. All public service workers who work 39 hours a week experienced unpaid increases in their working time. There is an estimated £430 million savings from increases in productivity deriving from almost 15 million additional working hours and a range of other reform measures. So when the Minister and others tell us how much they are increasing the pay of public sector workers, it's akin to saying that the burglar has come back to give you back some of the goods he stole from you. And I don't think we would say, thank you, burglar, thanks very much for giving me back that which you robbed. I don't think any of you here would welcome that, and neither do I welcome this bill in its totality. The theft of workers' pay and pensions was not negotiated. It was imposed by extraordinary means of legislation. Emergency legislation in this House. We cannot pass such legislation to deal, for example, with the housing crisis or the health crisis or climate chaos, but by God we can pass it to deal with cutting the pay and conditions of nurses, teachers, firefighters and clerical workers across the service. And we are continuing this years after government told us that we're in recovery, that the economy is booming, that the country is a great place to do business. We continue with the charade that we don't have a financial emergency, but we do when it comes to the theft of workers' pay and conditions in the public sector. So don't tell us that the recent pay and stability deal was offered to workers and that somehow the deal was voluntarily agreed. It was not. It was presented as the only game in town, and that if you reject it, that the government would wield the law like a big stick of FEMPI to impose it upon you, that you had no choice. And the proof is in the pudding, because that is what's happening to the teachers. This is supposed to be a democratic country. This legislation effectively removes the right of free collective bargaining from trade union members. So even though a majority of unions accepted the deal, this bill effectively punishes those who don't, and it allows for any rise offered to some workers to be withdrawn from other workers who reject a pay deal. It copper-fastens pay apartheid, Minister, in the public sector. It makes no reference to how and when workers and teachers, for example, might expect to get the pay for the same work for doing the same job, and nurses in particular are affected by this. It beds down the inferior pensions of new recruits and makes permanent temporary pension and emergency measures, introduced as emergency but now permanent in the years after the emergency has passed. It has normalised the emergency, the financial emergency, just like the Taoiseach attempts to normalise the emergency in housing. And indeed, I think we will have to restate what the Taoiseach sees as a republic of opportunities to see it as a republic of opportunists. And in that republic of opportunists, that especially favours former Taoiseach, former TDs and former ministers who will receive a handsome pension increase with new legislation to be introduced. So I think there's a lot left unsaid about the FEMPI legislation, and we will be introducing amendments to it.
Thank you very much. Now, Deputy Joan Collins.